I'm David's assistant from Laowa Photography, and today I'm trapped in a box.
Today we are checking out the Meike 85mm f2.8 1.5 times macro on the Sony A7R IV, and they claim this to be not only a macro lens but a portrait lens. So let's just dive into the design of this thing so you can see what it's like. Now, I believe this lens has an 11 bladed aperture. It doesn't actually say in any of the material when I'm looking for it, but that's kind of what they're hinting at. Really nice, smooth, clickless aperture. So if we look at the design of this lens, you'll notice that it has this built-in macro ring that goes from infinity to 1.5 magnification. This is actually really kind of cool. It's basically just an adjustable extension tube that they put on the lens. That part I really like. The only downside is you have your focus ring right here, which isn't a problem, but your aperture ring is in the very front and it's really thin, and it's hard to change your aperture without accidentally adjusting your focus. It does come with a lens hood, and the lens hood is really pretty nice. It clicks on there. There are no electrical contacts in this lens. This is what the lens actually looks like from the back. So if we bring our macro tube all the way in, you'll see it zooming in. The only other issue with this lens is there's no special glass in this at all. So there's no ED elements, there's no FLD elements. It can affect the performance of this. So let's go ahead and see what this thing is like in the real world, and let's take some test shots with it. Basically for this I'm using a saguaro rib that I found in the yard, and just shooting it like a regular manual lens. I can change my magnification if I want to by rolling this magnification dial on the back. The thing about this though, when you're moving this, it's about the same as moving the camera. So, because you're moving the entire lens, not the elements within the lens, away from the sensor, so it actually works out pretty well. But from here, I can stop down. Oh, the only thing that drives me nuts about this lens is that the focus ring and the aperture ring are right next to each other. And the aperture ring is really, really small, so it's really hard to grab it without grabbing the focus ring. So I'm going to go ahead and do this shot at f11. Alright, let me show you a few images that we shot. I think it's called a fire bush. It's right next to my studio, and it's almost like a tree. Anyway, this is how it blooms. Very unusual looking. And we're doing some good detail capture here. This thing is doing a good job on this photo. And you can tell what's sharp and what's not. It's not like super razor stupid sharp, but it does a pretty good job. I believe this is shot at probably somewhere in the neighborhood of f11, f16. I backed away from it quite a bit just to get more into focus so I didn't have to focus stack. And right here, I shot this at f2.8 just so you can see that, you know, it's not super sharp at f2.8. It does an okay job, and this isn't shot outside or anything, so it looks soft. But color-wise, it seems to be pretty nice. Now these are the flowers in my front yard, and they're just these like little balls. I can't remember what these things are called. Let me just go in and show you detail-wise. It does a pretty good job. So I shot this one again at, I think it was probably f11, and backed off quite a bit. Anyway, moving on. These are the more of the saguaro rib that I was shooting at the very start, and this was shot at f8. And I was probably a good 4 inches away. I wasn't at my maximum or anything like that. And this one was shot at f11, and I just like this because it looked like a dragon's head, so I thought it was kind of cool. It's at ISO 400, so there's probably just a little bit of noise in there, which there is, but still works. Let's talk about this lens as a portrait lens. This is where this lens, I feel, is not strong at all. I would not buy this for a portrait lens. Detail wise, if we look into her eyes here, you can tell at f2.8, it's just not super sharp. And again, the trickiest thing about this thing is the focusing. You know, when you're shooting somebody that's 8 to 10 feet away from you, when you're turning that lens, it's like these little microscopic increments and you're suddenly completely out of focus. And it is really tough to focus. It has a very short draw, which I am not a fan of. In the studio. So in the studio, you can see here, those chromatic aberrations are showing up more and more on her eyelashes, and you can see the purple fringe around my light modifier reflecting back from her eyes, and you can also see it very distinctively in her earrings. You know, still, it's like I said, it has no special glass in it. There is no LD or FLD or ED glass in this. It's just standard regular glass. So I was expecting at least a couple of elements that help control chromatic aberration, considering there's 11 elements in 8 groups, but no. So, but did okay. Looking at her earring again, you can see there's a little bit of purple fringing. Again, it's not horrible, it's usable, just not great. I'd expect something to be a little sharper, and again, focusing in on her even in the studio is just a little tricky. Here you can see the chromatic aberrations coming out a little bit more in the button on her shirt. So here's the comparison between the Laowa over here. So this is the Laowa 100mm lens at f2.8 versus the Meike over here, 85mm at f2.8. And right off the bat, you can see the Meike is actually very well controlled for barrel distortion. There just isn't any. And vignetting wise, the Laowa actually vignettes about a half a stop more, maybe a stop more. The vignetting is really well controlled on the Meike, which is actually quite nice. But here's the problem. So when we zoom in, this is what we're getting. And this is when your focus is completely dialed in. It just is not sharp, wide open. And when we go to the corners, that's when we see it even worse. At f5.6, you can see that the Meike is still just a little soft in the center. And as we go to the corners, you'll see that, yeah, there's some chromatic aberrations happening in this lens. Very minor, but still not great. As we go to the extreme corners, you can tell that they just don't hold up. So it's just not super great at f5.6. At f11, the diffraction is just barely starting to set in on the Laowa, but that's usually where I use it for the most part. The Meike is holding up pretty well here. Let's go back to the center line. You can still see that it has some very slight chromatic aberrations coming through, but nothing major. And as we go over to the corners, you can see now that it's responding a lot better, and it's almost on par with the Laowa. Not quite as sharp, but pretty close. Now at f22, again, the Meike is over here and the Laowa is over here. Now this is why I like the Laowa, because at f22 it's still very usable. And you can see that even though diffraction is set in, all this stuff can be saved with a little bit of sharpening, whereas the Meike is just past that point where things are just a little too fuzzy. So really, you can't do macro work at f22 on this lens. It has to be backed off to roughly f18ish, if you can tell where that is, since there's no marking for it, but it is just a little bit softer. Lens flare. So lens flare on this lens is actually pretty well controlled, considering it doesn't have any special glass in it. Inside, without the hood on, I didn't really get a lot of ghosting. There's a little bit, but it's nothing very dramatic. I think it actually held up pretty well, better than most 85mm lenses, and it was actually kind of surprising, but it did a good job. Outside, shooting through this tree, the lens flare was actually a lot more noticeable, but still very well controlled. So that was one of the nice things about it. If you notice the bokeh balls in the background, we're getting, you know, some heavy kind of onioning with chromatic aberrations around the ring. And that's because, again, there's no special glass in this at all. It's just very basic. Here you can see we've got just some ghosting overall, a little bit of chromatic aberrations, but you know, for a $300 macro lens, this does pretty good. The street test. So this is the how sharp is the field plane test. And I really like this test. So this is where I just took a shot outside of the camera sitting on the pavement and then did the stylize, find edges in Photoshop, and that gives you an idea of what the sharpness plane is like on the lens. And you can tell here that it's not actually completely straight. It actually has kind of a little bit of a bend to it. So we see this kind of mustaching on a lot of Samyang wide-angle lenses, even though on this lens it's very minor. This is done at f2.8, so this definitely gives you an idea of what the sharpness is like. Just not anywhere close to flat field. Now back in the studio, Heidi and I started to get a little bored, so she started dropping water for me. And we had a lot of fun doing this, and this was at 800th of a second. And I should have done this a little faster, you know, did it somewhere around the neighborhood of like 2,000th of a second to have things more sharp. But I do love the effect of it, and yeah, it turned out pretty cool. Even though this is ISO 400, I think it did a good job. And then this is where we started to get kind of creative and weird. So I had Heidi stick her hand under the glass, and then we just started shooting droplets hitting the glass. And this is where things got a little strange. Okay, so go ahead and get into position there. Do you want to do a big thing? That is just some terrifying shit. It's not a bad macro lens. It actually seems to work pretty good. Shooting in an environment like this, when you're close focusing in, especially on Heidi's face when she's under the table, wasn't bad to do. But when I did a couple of portrait shots of Heidi outside, the fine focusing is really hard to use on this. Just extremely hard, because you have to barely turn it. Now, as far as the extension tube idea that's built into this lens, that's actually really nice. I do love that feature. But the fact that the aperture ring is right next to the focus and you can't grab one without moving the other. And I don't have like huge hands. They're just normal hands. But somebody with really big hands is going to have a really major problem trying to use this. It does come with a lens hood, which helps with ghosting a little bit. But these are $269. The Laowa is $400. In reality, I'd much rather have the Laowa, and it's not like the Laowa is that much bigger. They're about the same size, just the Laowa is a little bit longer because it has the extension tube on it. That's kind of built into it for Sony E mount. So it's decent, it's not great, whatever. It's just another macro lens. So anyway, I hope you guys like this review. Give me a thumbs up, leave me a comment, subscribe to my channel for more information like this, and we'll talk to you guys later. See ya.